This is Synopsis, a series of conversations with composers in the framework of Abeceda Institute. I'm Nežo Zupanc, and today's guest is Michele Selvaggi. Michele, welcome, and please, a couple of words of introduction.
Sure. So, hi everybody. I'm Michele. I am a composer based in Basel, currently, originally from Toronto, Canada. I spent most of my life there, but I came here to do my master's, which I just completed, and now I'm doing something that,
Congratulations.
thank you. Uh, I'm doing something that we call Ergänzungsstudium, which is like an extension year that we offer in Basel for composers and performers at the academy who wish to take lessons, but not necessarily go to lectures. So it's sort of an excuse to extend the visa and stay here as a working composer. Um, but yes.
And
Um,
since you just freshly concluded the master's, what you were studying composition in the master's?
yes.
What was your subject? Maybe you can immediately. This is a conversation on compositional practice. Maybe we can approach it via you shortly presenting your work in master thesis.
Sure. My master's thesis. Okay.
Or or in general, however.
In general. I guess I can start off with my work in general, and then we can move into the master's thesis.
Perfect.
My work in general, at least for the last couple of years, has been very focused on the sensation of sound in a performance space and what sound can do to perception. So for the past 2 years of my master's specifically, I've been working with very almost trying to touch the tangible side of sound. So I work with a lot of noises and long textures and things like this. I've incorporated a lot of microtonality into my music. But I would say my music is super geared into this sort of electroacoustic noise. So I do use a lot of instruments, but I'm mainly assisting these instruments with a lot of electronics. A lot of people mistaken me just as an electronic composer, but I do write for a lot of instruments. And most recently, I've started, at least for the past year, I've really only been working on 6 solo works for instrument and feedback systems. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's many. And these feedback systems are in of themselves an instrument, but they accompany the instrument and become part of the instrument. So there's sort of this symbiotic mass of sound production.
So that's why it's solo, not duo.
Some of them, I would argue, they are duos, but I brand them as solos because sometimes the feedback part has a very, very prominent role, and that in itself it requires another player. And sometimes it's all by the performer or all by the computer. The computer does it by itself.
Just for my reference, these works are already published, right? Some of them.
Some of them, yes.
Recorded on your SoundCloud, right?
You can find 2 of them, I believe. There's one called All You Have Is Your Body for accordion and feedback systems. And then What Remains Can Seldom Be Obscured for contrabass and tam-tam feedback system.
Yeah.
So with these feedback systems, my goal, I guess, was to extend these instruments. And a lot of my research in my master's was about extending the materiality of the instrument. But the end goal of this whole thing was to play with entropy and the development of sound in a sort of scientific manner. So the feedback systems were an instrument or a means of playing around with entropy in the literal sense, which then would affect this sort of perceptual entropy that the listener, the audience, would be experiencing. So that brings me to my thesis. And the thesis was, I guess, a catharsis on everything that I've been doing I think, in my whole life. Not many people know this, but the people who might have come across my thesis will know this. Before I did music, I was a scientist. And the thesis is sort of this last breath of my science-ness, you can say. This is like I let what I had left out for the world. And it deals with these feedback systems, so specifically these solo works that I wrote for the thesis. And it touches upon how feedback systems can play with entropy and how this entropy actually affects perceived time. And it's a very out there concept, but if we had 3 hours of conversation, we could definitely get into it. But it's a very convoluted concept, and even I sometimes get confused with things. But the thesis is basically this playing with perception and playing with the categorization of sound. So entropy was a way of making it easier for me, as somebody who actually didn't have a lot of experience in music, to make it easier for me to feel comfortable ordering sounds in time, and after the fact to actually play with time, to how somebody perceives time based on how you weight different sonic structures in a grand scheme.
Perhaps can we, before you continue, can you give an example of entropy, perhaps a more common knowledge example of entropy for everyone that's listening and is not entirely familiar, including me? I just know entropy is when you put a glass of hot water into a cold space and it becomes cold.
Yes.
Is that a way to...
Sure.
Please correct me. And
So entropy, there's so many definitions for this word that even scientists don't have a common ground on it. But I guess the two most common definitions derive from thermodynamics and information theory. So entropy is basically sort of this measure in a given system, in a closed system, but this doesn't exist, but just in a system, of this lack of order or predictability. So in thermodynamic terms, you had it right with the idea of this glass being placed into another system, that the temperature would reach an equilibrium. So scientists say, and also in quantum mechanics, that the universe is approaching this sort of equilibrium, sort of this state of infinite disorder or chaos. And this chaos is the highest point of entropy. And if we get even deeper to it, this is the reason that time flows. So this entropy progression is what time really is. But to make it easier, entropy is...
That the border of physics that is between philosophy and physics, is that border in between?
Kind of, yeah. But actually, just in quantum mechanics, they say that the entropy is the time itself, and that time doesn't exist on its other... It's just entropy flow.
Wow. Okay. So back to your case. Back to your case with this still very abstract knowledge of what entropy is.
Yes. Should I continue on my works?
Yes, please. Now, this is just for a reference for anyone that's listening. So it's really, perhaps in simple terms, so that everyone can understand what this is in your compositional practice.
The entropy thing, you mean?
Yeah.
To put it into a few more accessible terms, I would say that entropy is sort of how I'm measuring in a sort of given system that I'm creating musically. So it could just be the actual musical system, so the layout of the notes or the sounds or the literal system that I'm building to accomplish this, so the instrument plus the feedback system often, but measuring different regions of complexity and disorder. And to measure these is to give them a sort of this assigned weight. And with this, I use this entropy as a way to sculpt dramaturgy in the music.
Also, with via assigned weight, like what is an example of that?
Okay. So if I were to, let's say, in a piece, I want to begin with something quite of a low entropy, of a low complexity, something that doesn't really prompt so much surprise in the listener. I will take, for whatever, before I write a piece, I'll create a scheme of many structures, and I assign them all sort of this entropy value. So a complexity with in relation to each other, so this sort of relational entropy. And given this, I can sculpt a dramaturgy smoothly or disjunctly or something like this. I can start with a low entropy and then gradually go to a high entropy to form a sort of gradual dramaturgy. Even though the music might not sound gradual, the dramaturgy with respect to the entropy might be. Or I can create very disjunct snippets of entropy change, and this can create a sort of choppy dramaturgy, which then instills in the listener sort of this element of surprise.
And with that sort of guiding your control of the structure of the composition, then the other parts, if we were to say, okay, let's say there are two parts, of course, I'm not claiming that really, but the other part would be the actual sound, what those sounds via which the entropy will come into reality as you intended it, the rate of it. Then you assign the sound, or let's say compose those sounds via which that realizes, if I understand correct.
Do you mean, do I use the entropy to actually make the sound, or do I take the sound and then find the entropy after that?
For example?
It's a little bit of both, actually. I mean, I would say recently, I guess for the entirety of my compositional journey, I've been really focused on getting the sound in my head out. So sometimes the entropy has nothing to do with that when I'm figuring out what kind of sound scheme I'm going to use. And then I afterwards have to order things with entropy. Or if I'm giving a system, or if I come up with a system and I'm unsure of the sounds to use, for example, I'm writing this piece right now for saxophone and feedback sheets, and the sound is very varied, and I was kind of at a loss for what kind of sound to use. So I just started off with this idea of entropy, and I used that to create the sound by playing with different parts of the entropic scheme of the system, or the complexity of the system, and whatever sounds happened, I just either accepted them or did not, and moved them on. I guess it was a way of inspiring me. But this is not very often the case. It's usually, the entropy actually has nothing to do with the sounds I choose, but rather with how I order them.
So, in a sense, you created with your knowledge that you still have from studying science or working in science. I don't know if you were already professional there as well.
No.
Okay, but you studied science.
I almost studied. I declined the study offer to do music on a whim, actually.
All All right.
It was a big it was a big decision, but I'm very happy with it now, I think. Yeah.
But via that, applying onto your compositional practice, I observe then creating a system that gives you a lot of control over the compositional output here. And I would say also it's a certain congruity between different recordings is audible. So I would never guess this is the system behind it. It's more on the intuitive level, just listening to your to recordings of your works. When you speak that this is the last breath of the science, what do you mean? What is your perspective on this? Because it seems like you have a certain outlook on this in your compositional practice, science and arts, let's say.
Yes. I guess I can start by explaining the science side. So for most of my life, actually, ever since I was a kid, I was really interested in this, in the realm of science that was dealing with astrophysics, chemistry, and geology. And as a kid, I was so enamored with it. Of course, I had no knowledge on it, but I was just fooling around and reading books here and there, and watching TV programs as children do. But as I grew older, I became sort of obsessed with science, and I became almost a mad scientist. So I would do things that kids should not do, like mixing various chemicals in a house or making fireworks from scratch. This is something I don't recommend. And I got the cops called on me many times.
So that's why you cut off the crazy scientist.
Yes, I had it. It's not here anymore, as you can see. But for the majority of my life, this was sort of my reality, and I was very obsessed with this, and it became a part of my character. And I was known as being this sort of pyrotechnic guy. And I still have this stuff back at my home in Canada. Of course, I didn't bring anything with me over to Basel, but at a young...
You could not reach the Basel.
They wouldn't let me over the border. But at a point, I think, when I turned 12, I picked up a couple books in chemistry and biology and biochemistry. And I became really enamored with sort of the methodology behind it. And I took a couple of classes outside of school to become, proficient in it. And then when I got to high school, so this is when I was between 14 and 18, I took sort of these advanced classes without knowing so much, just hoping that the teacher would then educate me. And I started looking very early on into university programs for chemistry. And by the end of my high school, so when I was 17, 18, it was very much set. For my whole life, I've been working up to this sort of science, and I need to now do it. My whole family was excited for it. There's so much money in the sciences, especially in biochemistry and stuff dealing with biology, of course. It's always needed. And I applied for many, many schools, and I got into my ideal school. But at the time, I was also doing a little bit of music as just this fun thing. I was playing trumpet and euphonium. So on a whim, something happened. I can't remember how it happened, but on a whim, I decided I can't do science. I'm going to be sad for the rest of my life. I'm going to be in my room, never leaving. I'm not going to be able to talk to people. I'm not going to be able to engage in the sort of discourse that I see happening with many other career paths. And I got scared. I was like, this cannot happen to me. So I just switched to music, just on a whim. I applied and somehow got in and decided to take an undergrad in music. And then I got nerve damage, so I couldn't do euphonium or trumpet anymore.
Oh.
Yes, it was a big thing. I was thinking of becoming a professional trumpet player, and then that fell off, so I did euphonium, and then that also fell off because the nerve damage was so bad that every single time I played it would quiver. I guess it was a sign from the universe to switch to composition, so I did. And I did my last 1.5 years of my undergrad in composition. And then I did my master's in composition. And then now I'm here. And so I guess the reason I incorporate, to take the whole tangent back, my life story back to, the reason I do the science is because I think somewhere deep down in my heart, I really do miss the familiarity that I had with the science side of this sort of childlike explorativity that I had before. The science was a way for me to do that, and it was sort of comforting. So in my music, it became a sort of foundation, a zone of comfort that made me feel like every single choice that I was making in this scientific light had to be right. So if I could justify it with my science, and if it felt right, then it must be right for me in this piece. So it's a kind of a crutch, if I'll say. Maybe it's a bad thing that it became that, but maybe it's a good thing. I still haven't decided. I'm still quite young in even music, and I'm still discovering what the science means to me. But it is the residual part of what I know how to be explorative. It is mainly my only way of being creative, because I never did music as a kid, and I didn't learn how to be creative perhaps like I would have liked to. And so the science is a way of me achieving that and approaching the music in a way that feels comfortable.
Curious. And how do you see an ideal compositional practice for your own case at this point?
Sort of what is my goal, you mean?
For example, yeah. Taking in acknowledgement that you're also in development, you're developing your practice. Nevertheless, what are you working towards at this point in compositional practice?
Okay. There's a bunch of things. I guess the end goal is to become a composer researcher. And I would like to sort of craft my own realm of research with the research that I've already done for the past couple of years. And I would like to craft it and bring it into a university setting where I can become a professor, perhaps, and teach a few courses on this sort of stuff, to maybe garner some outside interest into this scientific perspective on music, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who enjoys looking at it like this. And I mean, I don't want to be alone, so I want to get other people to actually help me figure out, these sort of questions that I still have left over and that I'm still working on and probably will have in the future. But I'd like to become a professor / composer, which means I would not like to throw away all the composing for people in sacrifice for research. I want to do them in tandem. My ideal is that I'm composing for people on the regular like I do now, while also being able to research into this entropy concept for some time. But the goal is that.
Yeah, why is it important for you to compose for people?
That's a good question. It's a difficult question, because I think composition for me, as scientific as it is and as scientific as I make it seem, it is super personal. So I guess the reason I chose it and the reason I do it is to discover myself. And I don't think you can do this alone. This sort of self-research, this sort of introspective discovery, it takes a community, of course, to discover oneself. This is what we say, right? And I think that writing for people is a way not only that I learn to understand myself, which perhaps is a little bit selfish, but I think every composer does this, but also to understand how I interact with people. So I need to write for people. I cannot just do music, on my own, sort of only electronic. I mean, I've tried it, and it wasn't so fruitful. I felt like I was really missing this sort of communicative aspect, because you don't really necessarily learn how to approach things better, because when you get other people's perspectives on sound, and you can see how they react to your output, or like your artistic output, it is such a fruitful opportunity to sort of discover how you can improve on that, but then in turn how you can improve on yourself, how you can discover this part of yourself that you're trying to discover with the music. You need people for this, I think.
Right. Mm-hmm. And to briefly jump back to music and science, and as you said, your desire to combine the two. What is your outlook on today's, how to put this, general conception of those two being separate, especially in regard to the historic application, well, specifically meaning that there was a time when these were anyway strongly interconnected, like the example of the Renaissance man, and like the example of old Greeks that, if I'm not wrong, used to teach through music, or right?
Yes, actually.
With instruments, singing, and what is your outlook on that when addressing this as sort of music, science, separate things?
It's I guess as I've seen, I think in the beginning of history, as we were talking about the Renaissance and the Greek music, there was this sort of focus on mathematics and tuning systems, and this sort of stuff was taught as a part of the musical teaching, and this was ingrained in the musical teaching. And as time, I think, moved forward and years have passed, this has changed. We don't necessarily teach this anymore, at least not on the undergraduate level, and not in many master's programs, unless they're in specific sectors, and sometimes they offer it. At least they don't offer this kind of stuff in North America. So what I've seen, and I think what is very saddening, is sort of this divergence between the sort of amalgam that there was between science and music and science. They sort of were highly interconnected, at least in the mathematical side. And that music
was also tightly connected to social order, at least according to some philosophers, right? So it's not just mathematics, right?
Right, exactly. And these things were all sort of intertwined. And it's a beautiful thing, because you can use the music to approach these sort of subjects, and it is sort of a means of dispersing them. However, as I've seen, as time has passed, this divergence has definitely happened, and the science or the mathematics, and even sometimes the philosophical part, has been left behind. And this is a little bit saddening, because I think that they should at least hold some ties to each other. I think now that they can definitely enhance each other in a way. But I would say at least in the educational schemes and sort of the institutions that I'm familiar with in North America, this is not the case. So I'm working to counteract that. I want to bring back the science, I want to bring back the math. I work, for example, with a lot of tuning systems in microtonality, and this is a way of getting the math back into it. And now with the entropy, it's getting the science, the mechanics, and the philosophy back into the music. And here in Europe, actually, it's well received, this sort of methodology, the mixing of the three. Mm-hmm. And that I really appreciate. That's why I'm here to work on
and I sensed it from your presenting your practice, since you in a way acknowledge, yes, this can be sort of a crutch in composition to merely rely on that.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of reiterating, and at the same time you still want to continue, but as per specific line of that, how to call it, practice, of that kind of practice, to the extent that you have an aspiration of actually building this into a program. That's really fascinating. What do you see then this program bringing, other than more people into research of the case that you built already, as I understood, in the master thesis and in your work in general? More insights. What do you see as more possible insights? Is there something that you expect, that you perhaps anticipate, that might arise from this?
Yes. I mean, the main reason is to bring the science and the music people together, to share their sort of very diverse insights into music or into science. But I think that for the musicians that will join this eventual program, hope that it happens, it is another way for people to approach sound. It's another way for people to understand why we do things sonically. So at least with this sort of sound categorization with entropy, it is a way of explaining why, for us, perceptually, we accept that something is right in music. And then we can use the entropy to explain it, or to make it at least explainable. Because sometimes without the science, I find that I go onto these sort of philosophical rambles, and I think this is great. I mean, music cannot just be science. This is absolutely wrong, and it should not be hyper-technical, and it should not be hyper-philosophical. I think it should be a very well conceived balance. But what I hope from this program is to give people another way of looking on, or making sense of why we do things in a particular way musically, or at least today, and why sort of this historical development of music has happened, and how we can explain this through sort of this science of our perception, and why we make these decisions, and why these decisions are right. And I guess in music, all decisions are right, but why do these decisions seem the most right, and why do they feel the most right? And I guess that's what I want to bring with the program to the musicians. For the scientists, I think for a lot of these science people, at least even for me, when I was not even familiar with music, I had no knowledge of music, and this was not a thing. And it's a shame, because I think that I think everybody should have at least one artistic involvement, be involved in some sort of artistic practice, even if in the slightest, whether it be drawing, music, or anything of the sort. And my goal is to bring the science realm, these people who perhaps are not so familiar with the musical realm, or maybe not given the opportunity to become familiar with it, to give them this opportunity to learn more about artistic output and sort of these very abstract things, but in a more scientific sense that is sort of accessible for them. So to bring more and garner more scientists to become, I guess, familiar and artistic themselves. Yeah.
So, sort of a bridge.
Yeah.
Rebuilding the bridge.
Yeah.
So when you were addressing what this could make for musicians, it reminded me of something I read in your biography, and I won't use correct words, but perception of, unpleasant being pleasant.
Yeah.
Can you speak more to that in regards to this question, both and your music? Why this is your central interest?
Yes, yeah,
right.
Sure. Yeah.
So, what are the exact words, and what is this? What is this?
So, I'm actually not memorized. I have not memorized my bio, but I can give you. Yeah. No, it's okay. It is at least this sort of familiar unfamiliarity that I'm working with. So this pleasant unpleasantness, because I think, at least when I was starting with music, I was enamored with beauty. And beauty can do great things. I mean, you can tell a lot of stories and take the listener on a plethora of journeys with musical beauty and the sublime. But I think what is missing a lot, and especially in my music, was this very unpleasant side. And as I was getting deeper into music and just growing as a person, I was learning that there's not so much beauty in there is a lot of beauty in the real world, but there's the other half of this sort of disgustingness that we have to deal with as human beings. And I want to speak on this, I guess, in my music, this unpleasantness, but in a way that is not just for you and me who are used to the contemporary music scene where things could just be gritty for gritty's sake. I also want it to be accessible to those who are not so familiar, who don't really subscribe to the gritty side of contemporary music. So I want to make it accessible for them too. So that's why I kind of pleasantly, unpleasantly write the music. But with regards to the past question, because I think I forgot it now, maybe you can remind me what was to connect it to the question.
It was on what your building could bring for musicians, and when addressing that, you, I think, almost touched on the pleasant, unpleasant, and the perception. I think through science, bringing also that aspect as a possibility to musicians, something in that realm. Does that ring a bell?
A little bit, yeah. Actually, I would say that before the science part came, in my practice, I was already trying to become disgusting in my musical practice. So I was already trying to be a little bit, the science has always been there, but before I really dived deep, I was always trying to find the next way to make something kind of ugly. And it wasn't working until I dived deep into the science, and until I dived deep into the sort of existential realm of classical mechanics and quantum mechanics and this sort of stuff. And what I think would be beneficial, if we can bring it back to how I was tying it in with the new musicians taking on this sort of eventual program, is that music isn't always, and our artistic output in general isn't always going to be beautiful, and sometimes it's going to be existential, and you have to be comfortable with that, because I think the only way that I'm comfortable with just the existential side of my human experience and journey in general is through this music and through accepting that through the science. The science is a means of making the ugly music good, I think, or making the ugly music good at being ugly, because I don't think I was so good at it before. Now I think I'm approaching it better.
Mm-hmm.
And for
But
other
what do you
musicians,
refer to when you say existential in this context?
this I will share with you and with all the others watching that at the beginning of my master's, I had a big change, I think, in my life. There were a lot of experiences that just flew by me, and many of them bad. But as we grow, this happens. And the only way I was able to, I guess, sort of accept them and move past them was to explore this realm of existentialism. And I became very existential. I went through a few periods of change that were quite dark and but very, very, very developmental. And for me, this was so fruitful. I think I really do not want to glamorize this, because it should not be glamorized, but the art helped me through it, and it helped me make sense of it. And now, in my art, I speak about that, this sort of existential fear of time. Because I'm just, every day is a new day, and you don't know what's going to happen. And it's scary to think about that it could just all not be here anymore. You could end at any moment. And to make sense of that, or at least to become a little bit more comfortable with it, I approach that in the music with this sense of time. I think time has always scared the living hell out of me. Always. I'm scared of this concept. I always have been. And then musically, even more. And I've always struggled with it. So then, for the past few years, time has been this big, overbearing, sort of grim void. And to deal with that sort of existential aspect of time, I work with it in music by becoming super, I guess, there's a word we use, what is it? I guess meticulous with the time. I make sure that everything in the time realm is perfect, or at least I try. And this is my way of becoming, to take sort of control and take time into my own hands, and to not let it take hold of me, or to not let it scare me so much, I guess. And I urge other musicians to do this too, because I think that I'm sure everybody struggles with this idea of time.
This is perhaps one of the generalizations that is easy to make, because time is always a theme in some way, one way or another, and everyone's handling it in their own way. So existence very tightly connected with time. And what if you wanted to make a soundtrack of compositions, your compositions, to listen to, for someone that would be, I would be really curious to hear this transition? Because you mentioned that you didn't manage to write ugly until you started integrating more of the science part. Could you now on the go tell us like pieces of music that one could go through to hear that? I think it would be curious.
I think, oh goodness, wow! Some of these pieces I just totally forgot about, that they're
Of course,
not
it's
a
years
part
probably in between.
of I have a couple on my desktop that I remember. So there are, I think the first piece that I tried to be ugly, but I failed in that regard. I think it still is a nice piece, but it was called An Inevitable Decay, Rot. So it was sort of dealing with this idea of eventual decay in a forest setting, but also just in a general human existential setting. This is the first piece. Then there is a piece that I don't know if I have posted. It's called Phantom Remnants. This approaches it a little bit better, but it's not really getting there. Then Midwinter Fractures for string quartet was about 33% on the way to becoming something that I was comfortable with. There is another piece. Landscapes Unfamiliar for a chamber ensemble. This is getting closer. This is almost 50% gritty enough that I feel comfortable with it. There was a decline, actually, right after that. I wrote this piece called Fetid Echoes, Rebirth. And I did this when I had a residency in Poland. And I tried to be ugly, but then it ended up being so beautiful that it got back to zero. And it was, I mean, not beautiful in a good way. It was not in a good way. I think I failed at being ugly in that respect. This piece you can maybe find online, I think, on a Polish radio station. Then there is another piece right after that. I think I went back to 50%. It's called Rusting Sloughing Away for piano solo and electronics. And then one of the pieces I'm so happy with, this is about 75% there. This is called Quondam Apparatus for chamber ensemble and Tengali machines that I wrote for here, the Tengali Museum in Basel. That you can find on my SoundCloud. And then I did this piece where everything switched, and it was actually ugly and actually disgusting. It was called, and the title already says it, As I Laid Flesh in the Puddle of Blood. And this is 80% there. And then now, I think the piece that I'm the most comfortable with, and it approaches this sort of ugliness the best, is this piece that I haven't released yet, but I will within the next coming months. I have to mix and master it. It's called And As the Ground Consumes for piano solo and feedback systems. And this was the second feedback work that I had written as a part of my series here in Basel. And this is just, I'm so happy with this work. I feel so happy with the result of it. This, I think, is ugly. This piece is ugly. It's disgusting. It's not covered in beauty. It's not trying to be beauty. It takes previous pieces and actually a lot of samples of my other pieces and just destroys them and turns them into this chaotic noise. It is also not very nice to the piano because there's a bunch of metal objects continuously rattling against the strings. So it probably would need to be restringed by the end of the piece. But this piece is very, very ugly. And
is it still composed with the entropy for the structure?
Yes. This is I think, the first piece where I really got the entropy thing right. This is where this was during my second year of my master's, and I think in the summer, just before my master's, I had started composing. It's the summer before the second year of my master's that I had been composing it, and I approached the entropy in a way that finally everything worked. This is the star piece that I will put on my portfolio. And this piece, I look back on it, and whenever I want to write an ugly section, because I often do, the pieces that I write now are very ugly, I look at this piece because I think it's the most successful I've been with approaching this sort of fetid chaos in the music. And that's I don't know if it will happen again with the next piece. Sometimes I make mistakes, and when we're writing, things change, and then when you look back on it, it's not exactly what you want. But when I relate it back to this piece, which I have in my mind, this is like the foundation with which I need to be disgusting with my music.
So all of this, by the way, thank you. This is a list of 8 compositions.
I hope it helps.
I will try to write it next. I will try to post it next to this video. What this makes me think of is what is beauty, and also in this context. And I'm saying it like I'm the first asking that question. I know I'm not.
I ask myself every single day. I still don't know the answer to these questions.
Hot water, yes.
Yes, it is.
No, but also inclination, again, hot water, of human being towards creating beauty. And let's say if one claimed that is so on your case, it could be confirmed, saying you had to build, you had to really, really work for it to not be to become ugly and disgusting.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, that whole conversation with your presentation with regard to your presentation, and second of all, what I recognize, and perhaps based on a slight misunderstanding, but there's an inherent acceptance of the existential that you speak of. And then again, back to terming what is beautiful. This is also, I am stemming from my own practice here. And on my case, I would ask, isn't that in itself also beautiful? So
the ugliness, you mean?
The acceptance of it as a necessity, of the acceptance of existential, resulting in that ugly compositional music. Isn't that in itself? I would say, they're saying, let's say, isn't that also beautiful, in a sense?
I would agree, yes.
Pardon me, I do consider the provocative part of this asking, and yeah.
I enjoy it. I think, but it's beautiful in a different way. The beauty that we're so familiar with, I think, is so comfortable that it is just familiar, and it feels like home. And I guess the beauty of accepting the existential is a sort of beauty that we're not familiar with. It is a beauty that has to be worked towards, and it's difficult to sort of approach because it is not something that we're directly and quite often presented in the daily life. Of course, I think that the way that I'm trying to make my music unpleasant as a way of approaching existentialism and accepting it, then in turn creates a beauty. But this has to be balanced. Because if I do it too much, then it becomes too beautiful and it becomes too comfortable, and then people will confuse it for something that is beautiful. But even then, I struggle because, what is beauty? It's much easier to say what is not beauty but then it's much harder to actually write music that is not beautiful. So there's this sort of just paradox happening, I think, and I think that it is beautiful to accept existentialism, to get back to the question, but
And what
it
that
is
would
difficult.
indicate to is also to grow a thought that is a form of thought that is malleable, and I mean, it does seem like you're very systematically going at something that so many of young composers are trying to say, which is this can also be beautiful, but in a very different sense. And it seems like you're making this system of thought where you can actually, in a controlled manner, reach that.
In fact, yeah, this is exactly the case. I mean, the main thing is, of course, this sort of self-discovery, and but of course, I'm very systematic in my approach to making that sort of output possible. I think, yes, I'm with many other young composers who are doing the same exact thing, and I learned from them, and I hope we can learn together. I hope they can learn something also from me, that there are different ways of doing this sort of ugly composition. I use the word ugly a lot, and I think it maybe inspires some sort of preconceptions in the listener that perhaps shouldn't be there, but the ugliness is just a sort of uncomfort, like this discomfort with the unfamiliar in the musical sense, in the sounds that are unfamiliar, things that happen at unfamiliar times. So I tried to do this very systematically. I guess the science is a way of doing that, but I'm still working towards it. I'm still learning how to be better with it. I haven't been doing this for too long, but you know.
Yeah, and therefore, just last remark. You already mentioned the crucial component of this is that if you do it too much, it's again becomes the comfortable. So a crucial component is that it's an ever-changing system as well.
Yes, I recommend to everybody who wants to do something like this, you have to really study up on some perception, because you have to understand how the human mind works and what we expect. Because if you do something too much and it becomes expectable, it becomes comfortable, and then it loses its power. And to reach this sort of middle path is extremely difficult, because you're always sort of skittering on this sort of gray line of the sort of median point, this perfection, and where it is just ugly enough that it is actually ugly, and not too good at being ugly that then it makes the listener feel, oh, you know, this is like quite beautiful. You have to, it's such a difficult line to be skittering on, and I mean, no music does it perfectly. Although I have lots of composers that I know who do it so well, and I really look up to them. And I'm trying to figure out how to stay on this line, this sort of midpoint in the parabola where it's just perfect. But I'm still studying, you know. I'm still studying.
Certainly. And that's how it goes, right? Keep on.
The journey.
So, since we're now at the end of this conversation, for the conclusion, I would ask you to give 2 short messages. First one, despite, yes, you are in development and studying composer, but nevertheless, for anyone that aspires to begin with composition. And second one, to anyone that will go and listen to your music after perhaps hearing this conversation.
Sure. I will give to those who are looking to study composition, or people who are interested in this and who are maybe not familiar with it already, learn how to build everything that you will need to make the sounds you want. There are not so many opportunities to do this, so you have to do them yourself. Learn how to build from scratch all the sounds, all the systems, all the instrumental just combination. Learn from the scratch how to make this sound in your head possible. Then everything comes afterwards. You're going to still be working on this, sort of crafting the medium through which you achieve the sound, but you need to know this first. At least this is what I believe. And for those who are looking to listen to my music after listening to this interview, it is not so obviously scientific when you listen to it, but it's not supposed to be. So don't go into it with the idea of it's supposed to be scientific. It's not supposed to sound that way. In the background, there are these sort of things that I was doing to incite certain perceptive responses. And through that, I use science. But when you're listening to it, just focus, I guess, on the sound and your internal perception of time. This is what I really want the listener to. When they listen to my music, focus on the sound. Close your eyes. I barely put videos of my music because I think that for a lot of my music, I enjoy the sort of gestures and things that are visually available to the listener and the seer. But at first, when listening to my music, close your eyes. Just in a dark room and feel the sense of this sort of shifting time. That's what I urge the listener of my music to do.
Michele Selvaggi, thank you for sharing today and joining this conversation. Thank you.